3 countdown. Hello and welcome to Everybody's Business. I'm your host Valerie Hellerman and I'm here in Dharamsala, India, seat of the Tibetan government in exile. My two guests today are right here on my right, Nynjey, who works as a human rights activist on the Tibetan issue, and Lukar Jam, who's president of Gu-Chu-Sum, the Ex-Political Prisoners Association. Welcome.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to be in your town, and there's a lot of activity going on right now because tomorrow is March 10th. And can we start with you just telling us a little bit about what March 10th is about?
Oh yes, good morning to the viewers. March 10th is actually the Tibetan annual yearly anniversary of the Tibetan National Uprising, which was first occurred in 1959 when the Chinese actually occupied Tibet. In 1959 on March 10, all the Tibetans people all over the world, they rose up against the Chinese. And the Chinese actually crushed the rebellion. And following that rebellion, many Tibetans, thousands of Tibetans actually, led by their leader, the Dalai Lama, actually escaped to India. And since then, the March 10 has been celebrated as the Tibetan National Uprising Day.
So what's happening now? What's the current situation in Tibet?
The situation is extremely terrible, extremely violent, because as we know, in the media, there's this all this talk about self-immolations, more than 100 Tibetans actually self-immolated. And it's not just the self-immolations only, there are other issues of cultural destruction, cultural alienation, economic marginalization. So the situation is extremely urgent, but at the same time there are also hopes, signs of hope, in the fact that all the Tibetan people have now have reached a consciousness of being Tibetan. The fact that the self-immolations, not just the self-immolations, but other forms of protest has actually unified the whole Tibetan people to resist against the Chinese. Yes, on the one hand there's despair, but then also on the other hand there's hope.
And now with the new Chinese leadership, is there more hope for Tibetans?
No, we don't actually rely our hopes on the Chinese leadership at all. The reality of colonization and occupation is that you always have to fight against the colonizers. There's no way you can rely on the occupiers. They are the ones actually who actually occupy you and dominate you and denies you your freedom. But we rely our hope on the Tibetan people, on the Tibetan resistors, not just the self-immolators, but the artists, but the writers, but the religious people, but common people. So that's the hope we rely on.
And those people are keeping the culture alive.
Yes, yes. If you look at the protests and the resistance of Tibetan artists, Tibetan writers especially, Tibetan poets, it's amazing. And this is the only way, this is the right way to protest the Chinese occupation, because it not only gives us hope, but it leaves behind a history, a memory, a story that the world can read and take inspiration from.
Mm-hmm. Now, and what is the feeling here in the Tibetan community in exile?
The feeling is mixed, a mix of despair, sadness, but at the same time pride, joy and hope. Despair because the conditions are extremely terrible, but at the same time hope or pride because the Tibetan people have not given up to oppression. They have resisted, they have kept their hope, they have kept their dignity, and they have shown that despite the small population of Tibet, despite the overwhelming Chinese might, Tibetan people can still rise up, and rise up in such a way that is very inspiring, in the sense that they never harm the Chinese enemies, whether it's the poets or even the self-immolators. It's purely non-violent and very inspiring. I think the world can actually learn a lot from the Tibetan resistance.
Yeah. And Lukar,
Yes.
Your organization, that Gu-Chu-Sum, many ex-political prisoners come here to live in exile.
Yes.
And what is their feeling about the Tibet issue right now?
I say hello and Nynjey la translate. Handi lamna. Anta chapse chomba dizula. Sosu payu logma tibati. 강이 치시 이제 삼고도시.
I think the biggest problem of the political prisoners is the fact that they can't return back to their own country.
디 강이 치시 디 가리르즈나 야미 올란 로니 강라 다 파송 고다고 그랬어. 니 단다 공니션 바나지. 지금 니 야가니 신이 도고 말이 갱고디도 차시네. 니 파 로니 강라 야미 고다고 그래. 다디 니 진이 도고 말다 단다게 강이 치시시 데레서.
So the biggest problem is the dilemma the Tibetan political prisoners, not just the political prisoners, but the Tibetan elders face. The dilemma of the fact that they don't want to die in exile, they want to go back to Tibet, but at the same time they can't go back to Tibet under the present Chinese conditions because there's no dignity. And if they want to return, they want to return with a certain amount of dignity and pride.
What would happen to them if they tried to return?
But kiसी लोबर इसे ना खाची जैसे.
사실 파 로바지나 공충 아니야는 탑수 띵양게 말했어. 다소 카우드다 잡수 전발은 미리 지금 바우인다 그랬어. 미리 지금 바우다 미리 지금 탑수진이 미드조다 파쇼 걸러라쇼 탑수가 아니야는 탑수띠 버게 차상진이 갈라 아니 미리 띠그 셈식이 차는 거 딱갱이 치시 되래서.
Yes, because if they return to Tibet, they'll be humiliated, they'll be oppressed. Especially if a political prisoner returns to Tibet without dignity, this will be really, really discouraging because the political prisoners, this is not a matter of a personal issue. They are representing the Tibetan struggle, Tibetan nationalism. So if they return without any sense of dignity, it's a big humiliation to the Tibetan struggle as a whole. So that's the biggest challenge.
The Tibetans themselves in Tibet would not welcome these people back and treat them as heroes.
변한 게 미저와 이제 네팔 롱이들랑 가수슈제 가수슈는 이제 바우진 원지신이 디싱만 됐습니다.
다 단다 갑라 미망이니 나주 드니파 도니 간다 레와 가리키도 고레 오바 가리키도 고레 나주 파 도니 간다 차킨티 참고 그랬어도 나주 파 도야티 야밀랑 고 딱바이나 자와니니 고 말했어도.
So he thinks that if the political prisoners return to Tibet, they have to return with a certain sense of dignity and pride. Whereas if they return without any dignity, pride, by just obeying to the Chinese, this will not bring kind of a sudden satisfaction and pride among the Tibetan people inside Tibet as well.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the cultural challenges for being Tibetans in exile and also keeping the culture alive in Tibet with so much, the Tibetans are so marginalized. I'm not sure if I'm right about the population numbers, but there's something like 8,000 Tibetans and how many Chinese now living in Tibet?
Yeah, I agree. There's this challenge of demographic kind of aggression in Tibet. But when it comes to culture, when it comes to literature, when it comes to beauty and humanity, it is not about the numbers. It is about the conscience. It is about the honesty. It is about how you overcome the suffering. So yeah, on the other hand, Tibetan people have been going through like terrible times. But then terrible times are also like a kind of opportunity to show your humanity, to show your endurance.
That's a Buddhist culture there.
There's also Buddhist culture. It's also human culture, I think. It's not just Tibetan. Even if you look at other cultures and other countries, during times of terrible times, they have great people emerge, be it like poets, prophets, revolutionaries. So in the case of Tibet, also this is happening. And there's a precedent to that as well. Many great poets have emerged in Tibet and still emerging in the midst of Chinese oppression. Even in exile, because of being exposed to different culture, different people, because of many confusion, because of many despair, many depression, there's this chance of artists, writers, singers, they're making attempts actually. So yeah, it is very terrible on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's also a good opportunity for people.
Now, it's my understanding, though, that many of the artists are really oppressed and they're imprisoned for some of their works. I know about the Tibetan musician who was in jail for, is he still in jail?
Yes, many musicians. For instance, there's this great musician called Lolo, and if you listen to his song, he sings like folk songs. And his voice is enough to stir your emotions and your soul. So these artists are very powerful in the sense that they can really communicate the Chinese brutality in a way that can inspire people, ordinary people. So So that's why the Chinese, the communist masters are very intelligent. So that's why they crush them. But then the Chinese are also like getting themselves into a trap. By crushing them, there will be more resistance. So yes, not just musicians, but poets, essayists have been put in prison. And now the Tibetans inside Tibet are celebrating actually the courage. And you see in exile, many poetry sessions are organized. People are trying to write poetry, trying to make music. So there's a lot of activities that are going on as well.
So speaking of living in exile here in India, what does that do to culture? I mean, we're combining cultures here. Tibetans have come to live here in India, and you don't have citizenship in India, but India allows you to be here and allows you to be Tibetan.
Right.
So your culture is allowed to be kept alive,
Right.
but it's influenced by being in India.
Right. That's very true. Especially if you live in exile. Exile is the state of exile is that you are not grounded. There's this lack of being attached to the native or to the ground. But at the same time, exile also gives you that different perspective. Being mixed with different cultures. And the good thing about India is that although we don't have citizenship rights, but India allows to flourish our culture. India allows to study our own literature, our own drama, our own music, our own religion. India allows to build Tibetan schools, Tibetan library. And at the same time, the Indian school, we learn English. So through English, we get access to different literature and culture. We can read Shakespeare. But it is not easy, reading Shakespeare is not easy. Reading Tibetan literature is not easy. You have to really fight. You have to really struggle. You have to especially for a Tibetan refugee, when the economic conditions are so poor. It's very difficult. It's a huge challenge. So that's why many young Tibetans are not able to read them. But then there are other Tibetans as well who are able to read them. So yeah, it's a kind of mixed situation. It's very, very tough. But also there's a sense of hope and opportunity as well.
I'd like to speak a little bit about the issue that Tibetans who have been welcomed in India, but have not, even third generation Tibetans have not been granted citizenship. And what does that mean when you don't have a citizenship in the country you live?
I think if you look at the Indian constitution, especially those Tibetans who are born and brought up in India, people like me, or the third generation as you put it, they have a right to seek citizenship. But as of now, we have deliberately chosen, I emphasize the word chosen, not to seek citizenship. Because we have still not given up our hope for Tibetan independence and Tibetan freedom. And that's why we have not chosen to seek citizenship. But in future, we might choose citizenship and also fight for Tibetan freedom as another alternative. And that might come in future, or that might not come in future, because future is open-ended.
But so the Indian constitution will allow a second or third generation Tibetan to apply for citizenship.
Yes. In fact, there is a precedent. 2 years ago, one Tibetan girl, born and brought up in India, she actually applied for citizenship based on Indian constitution, and she was granted the Indian citizenship. So yeah, there's a precedent. And many people are actually talking about the option of seeking citizenship, and people have actually written about that. But so far, the majority of them have not actually opted for this option.
And choosing to remain a Tibetan living in India with an RC card, a refugee card. So you don't get benefits from the Indian government, but the Central Tibetan Administration does have a very good welfare program for Tibetans.
Right. CTA has a welfare organization. It looks after the Tibetan refugee welfare programs. It runs schools and it runs other welfare organizations like hospitals, homes for old people. And good thing is that the Indian government is also helping in the Tibetan education system. And then also some foreign aid organizations are also helping. But the truth of the matter is that the Tibetan people are not only just relying on the charity and hope, charity only, they are also independent Tibetans. You see, if you look at the Tibetan business organizations, and if you look at the Tibetan sweater sellers, although they must be selling sweaters in the dust and in the cities, in the ghettos, but they have earned their living out of honesty and hard work. Same as the Tibetan agricultural settlements, they have earned through hard work. But there's also danger in exile. Many youth are now kind of losing their ground. People are losing for drugs and alcohol. But the humanity has still retained. But there's also hope, and this hope is very much symbolized by the image of the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
And also like Tibetan resistors and Tibetan strugglers, the former political prisoners, the Tibetan writers, Tibetan dissenters. So it's a mixed combination of hope and despair.
So I'd also like to address the issue of, Tibetans have done so well in exile in many ways. Like, I have just been here with the Tibetan Children's Education Foundation and have visited the Tibetan charity. I do want to just stop, and that was our Lobsang Wangyal, our Tibetan chaiwala, who makes the best chai in Dharamsala.
In the world.
In the world, he says. So I have been very impressed with the programs that the Tibetans have set up for themselves. It's remarkable. Now, I would have to say that because India has allowed Tibetans to come into the country is a very big thing, because many other refugees don't have that advantage. But the Tibetans have proven themselves to be very resourceful and very tenacious people.
Right.
And that's very admirable.
Yes, the good thing about the Tibetan struggle, especially the Tibetan refugee community in India, is that, by and large, whatever the Tibetans have achieved, although it's not very big, it's very small and minor, their achievement is based on struggle and honesty. I think this is very inspiring, to be honest, especially in a world with so much corruption. But on the other hand, there are also many challenges. As I said, many youth are being lost to drugs, to drinks. People are deracinated, and
is that due to the economics, do you think?
It's not just it's more cultural. It's loss of the sense of cultural reality, the sense of Tibetan history, having lost the touch with the Tibetan homeland, and also the dream of returning to a free Tibet is kind of now being compromised. So that is bringing a lot of confusion inside Tibet, inside among the young generation. So that needs to be kind of sorted out as well.
So what can we do for the Tibetan issue? I mean, I see that in the West and even here in India, China is a huge economic power, and nobody wants to go up against China. Our government has received the Dalai Lama. Hillary Clinton has gone to China and said that they have to, talk about Tibetan autonomy. But, China is so powerful because of economics.
Right.
What is it that we can do to get this issue out there to help?
Right. I think, there are two ways of actually looking at the struggle, to fighting the Chinese occupation in Tibet. On the one hand, as you said, there's this the role of the government. As you said, the American government actually receiving the Dalai Lama. That also has a place. But I think, to me, the real struggle has to come from the grassroots. So we have to think and reimagine our struggle in such a way that can we produce, great people? Can we produce Tibetan Gandhi? Can we produce a Tibetan Martin King? How was Martin King produced in America? What were the conditions? How did people do that? So if we can learn from them, and if we can somehow contribute that to the Tibetan struggle, then we can see two kind of varieties and two versions of struggle. On the one hand, there's this government and the institution. Then on the other hand, there's this Tibetan resistance from the ground reality. So it has to be a long-term project. So Americans, especially, I think, in my own experience, especially in Dharamsala, so far, I can appreciate the help of Americans, but I haven't seen Americans actually coming from America and bringing in rich American legacies of American freedom fight. Be it like Martin King or the American revolutionary fight against the English colonizers. I haven't seen